Now, shifting gears to Webster Tarpley, again, doctor of history, also an accomplished economist and author. He's written the unauthorized biography of Barack Hussein Obama and George Herbert Walker Bush, both seen as seminal research tomes for the roadmaps to understand these important globalist frontmen. Here's just some of the headlines. Protests spread to Saudi Arabia. Military trying to open fire, knowing that they could be overthrown at any time. Also, Britain looks into freezing assets of Mubarak and his associates, upwards of $7 billion. The Swiss are talking about grabbing it. Conveniently, we now learn that, as Tarpley said, there was a counter coup going on last Thursday. Tarpley said, who knows if he'll step down, or was it Wednesday? The CIA chief, Padetta, had said he will step down in the next 2 hours. He didn't step down. He came out and defiantly gave a speech. Then magically we now learn that he reportedly was flown to Israel and had a stroke of some type. And then we heard he had the stroke in Egypt and was flown to Israel. Very, very suspicious, classic type attempted assassination or drugging. We see this with Yasser Arafat. We see this with Ariel Sharon. We see this with Ronald Reagan after he was shot. Never really coming out of his days, except when they drug him up and roll him out to read off cue cards. And now they're trying to overthrow these other countries in the strategy of tension. And what does this say to the Saudi Arabian despots, the royal house of Saud? They've got trillions, not $7 billion. The globalists want to overthrow that, put extremists in, steal that money, and then use that destabilization as a pretext to expand the globalist presence in the Middle East. There's no doubt that Tarpley was right about all this. Going back a year ago, he said, look for Berlusconi to be attacked with scandals. There were no scandals at the time. Boom. He's now been indicted in prostitution probe. That's out of the Associated Press. So the globalists are moving. And he said, look for him to move against Berlusconi. We're not saying Berlusconi's good. We're not saying Hosni Mubarak's good or King Fahd is good. The point is that the globalists are now turning on their cohorts, and this signals an unthawing of the geopolitical strategy and an acceleration of the Brzezinski kamikaze model. Do you concur with the breakdown of what I've put out, Webster?
Yes, I think that's about right, Alex. What you're looking at now is a general assault on the modern nation state by the empire. And it's the goal of this is to simply wipe out entire nations, reduce them to chaos, reduce them to regional entities. We've seen Sudan in the middle of all this. Sudan carved into two parts by a process of secession, which the British had been backing for decades, really for the best part of 100 years. And I think you can expect that to come in other places.
And we see the chain reaction, break down the great game, what we're talking about here.
Oh, we're in a depression, and in the middle of this depression, the depression obviously poses a threat to the City of London and Wall Street. If the nation-states declare Wall Street and the London banks bankrupt, then we can get out of the depression. But what we're now seeing is the City of London and Wall Street unleashing their intelligence agencies and all their counter-gangs and all their spooks across the world to destroy the nation-states, to knock the nation-states onto the defensive, so that Wall Street and the City of London can triumph over a ruined world. And obviously, they would like to take this all the way. When you saw Egypt go down, you immediately heard these manic voices coming out of the CIA milieu, saying, in effect, we can take this all the way to Iran, we can take this all the way to Beijing, we can take this all the way to Moscow, and there's nothing to stop our world empire. Now, obviously, that's a lot of manic nonsense in there, but it is a very, very dangerous game. Let me just point
Well, hold on. Before you point it out, they were able to now take down Egypt. The question is, how is that going to end? But I want you to get into this. Hosni Mubarak reports in the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, BBC, that he said, I'm not going to step down, and then magically gets ill, has a stroke. I mean, this is very, very suspicious.
Look, I think these are cover stories. The fact that we have is that by last Thursday evening, the CIA coup d'etat in Egypt was dead in the water. The putsch had stalled out. It was going nowhere. The generals loyal to the CIA, this Tantawi and Annan, had tried everything to get Mubarak out, and he would not leave. And of course, this gaggle of rich elitists there in that square, right? The Twitter and Facebook fans from the wealthy neighborhoods of Cairo North, these are a bad joke, even when they're supplemented by a certain amount of myrmidons from the Muslim Brotherhood.
And you've got the gaggles of Soros people. You've got the Google man in there running the whole thing.
Right. So think of it now. On the morning of the Friday, the morning of the day that Mubarak finally was forced out, there was a meeting of the Supreme Military Council, and that came out with an endorsement of Mubarak. Take a look on the Internet. Military Council communique number 2. I found this in a number of, the Times of India, the Deccan Times, the various places around the world. It's there. It's probably a Reuters wire. So in that morning, Mubarak had the military in his pocket. What is it that changed it? Now, the obvious question is, what kinds of threats were delivered overnight? You can imagine Obama watching that speech by Mubarak on Thursday afternoon, where Mubarak was hanging tough, and then Obama chewing the carpet, going wild with rage. Similar scenes in Langley at the CIA, similar scenes at Foggy Bottom at the State Department, similar scenes in the National Security Council. They then obviously mobilized everything they had, because this is now a question of imperialism. Is there imperialism or not? Can you bring down Egypt or can you not? And if you can't, then the entire complexion of the Middle East changes. Now, the obvious things, therefore, are threats, right? I don't know what threats, but we can assume some pretty heavy-duty threats to Mubarak, to his wife Suzanne, to his son Gamal, to his other son Allah, I think his name is, or Awa, and then he's got a granddaughter. He's got property. The threat that I think makes the most sense is the threat to seize the Suez Canal, and I would take this absolutely seriously. Just to tick off the pieces that were on the board, the U.S. had a task force in the middle of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a sea-level canal. In the middle of it, there's this thing called the Great Bitter Lake, with the city of Ismailia on the Egyptian side. Sitting in the Great Bitter Lake is the USS Kearsarge with several thousand Marines, and its main function is to deliver Special Forces commandos into situations. Now, they said, of course, this is for the evacuation of U.S. nationals in case the situation gets ugly, but it could just as easily be the spearhead of something to take over the Suez Canal. We also had, on the 5th of February, I believe, a bomb exploded at the pipeline which takes natural gas from Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula into Egypt, into Israel, and then into Jordan as well. And the Israelis then began saying this is a definite threat to our national security because we get large proportion of our cooking gas and heating gas from this natural gas pipeline. Then you had a strike by the employees of the Suez Canal. Sit-down strike. They're not collecting the tolls. Now, they're also not maintaining the canal. And the problem with the Suez Canal is the sides are always caving in, so you've got to have a constant process of keeping it open. Remember that when the British and the French, with Israeli help in 1956, tried to seize the Suez Canal back from Nasser of Egypt after he had nationalized it and brought it back to Egyptian control, one of their arguments was that the Egyptians are not capable of running the canal. We enlightened, educated Europeans are needed to do this, so we've got to go back to imperialism or they're gonna mess up the canal. Then you have these reports coming out of Israel from the various Debka and Ynet and these kinds of sites that the Hamas fighters had successfully infiltrated themselves out of Gaza and into this large area of the Sinai Peninsula. Take a look on the map and you'll see how big it is. But it's between the Suez Canal in the west and the Israeli border in the east, and of course the Gaza Strip is there too. And the Israeli accounts then say it's not just Hamas fighters you've got there, but you've got Jaish-e-Islami, and that means Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, in effect, is at the Suez Canal. Now, imagine the headline. Obama orders Marines to seize Suez Canal to protect it from Al-Qaeda terrorists, right? It would be easy. 1 RPG fired at a tanker, and you would have the pretext. So at a certain point you could say Egypt is descending into chaos, therefore the U.S. has to seize the Suez Canal to keep it open.
All right, let me stop you for a moment and bring this in, and then we're going to look at the larger geopolitical ramifications and where the globalists with the great game are going with this. A week ago, Business Insider and others reported from their sources that Marines are standing by and are quietly being deployed. I separately talked to a Marine this weekend who's part of FAST. That's the USMC's Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team. FAST company entry, and they are preparing to be now sent to Egypt. So what you just talked about with Marines, that's already in Congress. That's already moving.
Well, this is now open-ended because really now at any time the U.S. could declare Egypt is in chaos. The 10% of world trade, 10% that goes through that one canal, is in danger, and therefore we've got to go in to maintain order. Now, in 1956, it was the British and the French with commandos, the Israelis attacking overland. Who knows what it would look like this time? But the goal of getting the Suez Canal, of course, is once you've got it, you find reasons why China can't be allowed to use it because they're a threat. Therefore, the entire Chinese commerce between China and Europe, a lot of that goes through the Suez Canal. Most of the high-value stuff certainly does. You find reasons why the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians have to be kept out of the Suez Canal.
But earlier you were pointing towards a globalist staged fake al-Qaeda event on the Suez. That is where the Marines and others are massing for the staged event. Explain to people who would be behind that and then what that will trigger. And now we see the globalists running the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to overthrow Saudi Arabia. I mean, clearly, this is one of the biggest moves we've seen pre-2003.
Yes, it's essentially the idea that the imperialists have never given up on controlling the Suez Canal. It's obvious. These are the naval choke points of the world, right? The narrow seas in British geopolitical or maritime doctrine. If you control the Straits of Hormuz, you control 25-30% of the world's oil coming out of there. If you control the Suez Canal, you control 8 to 10% of world trade that goes through the Suez Canal. Similarly, if you control the Straits of Gibraltar and these other narrow seas, right, where the land masses come together, if you control those, then you're on your way to world supremacy. And again, the main issue today is how do you keep the Chinese out? How do you keep the Russians out? How do you keep the Iranians out? But I think, above all, the Chinese. So it seems to me that that is one of the things that might have been told to Mubarak is if you don't decide to leave now, there will be chaos, and within 5 days, and we can, of course, make the chaos more acute, right? We can come up with false flag events that will make it look really bad. At that point, the imperialists may want to take over the Suez Canal, and they'll have reasons to do it. And
Israel's been saying for 2 weeks they are prepared to go into Egypt right now. That's openly on their news stations, in their newspapers. They're getting the Israeli population ready for it.
But they also say, however, that the Israelis, one of their arguments is that their Sinai front has been neglected. For the 30 years now that the Camp David Treaty has been in effect, one of the effects of Camp David is that the Egyptian military presence in the Sinai Peninsula is radically reduced. And that's, of course, a reason they say that's why Hamas and al-Qaeda can run wild in the Sinai.
And so if they've lost in Lebanon 3 years ago, have a new front and basically turn west, and so this allows that greater Israel.
It's certainly a possibility. Again, I think the Suez Canal is the real prize, but there may be people who want the Sinai Peninsula as well. The things that I've seen, the Israelis are lamenting that they don't have their tank divisions ready for desert warfare of the type you'd have in the Sinai. They have their divisions ready for mountain warfare on the Lebanese or Syrian fronts, but not for the other front. So there are various stories floating around, but the general thrust is pretty clear, I think. There are designs on the Suez Canal.
Let's talk about what this major chess move signifies and what the next moves are going to be.